Very nice to see you.
What's the way to solve the conflicts in the Middle East? On Talk to Al Jazeera this week, a man who tried to figure that out for President Obama. A senior advisor on the region in the last White House, Robert Malley now heads one of the world's leading think tanks, the International Crisis Group. He gives us his view of President Trump's efforts to produce the deal of the century between Israelis and Palestinians. We talk about the brutal wars in Yemen, Libya and Syria, and the threat of an even bigger conflict between the US and Iran after President Trump pulled out of the nuclear deal of 2015, a deal Malley helped to negotiate. Robert Malley, President of the International Crisis Group, thank you for talking to Al Jazeera. Let me start, for our viewers who don't know the International Crisis Group, tell us about your organisation, the one-minute version, please.
Sure, and I hope there are not too many who don't know about the organization, but it's great to be here. This is an organization that is pretty unique. It starts with people on the ground, people in conflict areas, and their goal is to come up with ideas to resolve, prevent, or mitigate deadly conflict, and then come up with practical recommendations that we could then advocate on behalf of the organization to leaders and civil society and non-state actors around the world.
You wrote earlier this year, for an American who had a hand in shaping US Middle East policy during the Obama years, coming to Yemen has the unpleasant feel of visiting the scene of a tragedy one helped to co-write.
Right.
Explain that.
You know, and it was at a time, as we write in this piece, where the United States was in the middle of negotiations on the Iran nuclear deal, causing huge tensions with Saudi Arabia and some of other allies in the region. And the feeling was, Saudi Arabia came to the U.S. and said, the Houthis have taken over Sana'a, they've taken over Yemen, they are an Iranian proxy. If we don't react, and if you don't help, and we will react anyway, and if you don't help us, it will be an act of betrayal because we feel like our existence or our security is at stake because of the presence of this militia armed by Iran on our southern border. And I think the decision then that President Obama made and the administration made was, even though there were huge reservations about how quickly the war would end, about how close the Houthis at the time were to Iran, and how much we would make them closer if this intervention took place. But the feeling was we can't afford another rupture with Saudi Arabia, which could be a major one after coming in the wake of the Iran negotiations. And so the president had this view of we could help Saudi Arabia defend its security, defend its borders, defend its territorial integrity, and we're trying not to get too involved in the war against the Houthis. But in a way that was getting half pregnant, because once you support Saudi Arabia, once you support the Saudi-led coalition, support is fungible. And the U.S. became complicit in what today the United Nations says is the worst humanitarian crisis we face. So this is a case of tragedy in which U.S. fingerprints are very present. I welcome the fact that, and our organization welcomes the fact that the U.S. Congress is now trying to reassert itself and trying to say, wait a minute, this is a war, and the U.S. Congress is the entity that has the right to begin and end wars, and therefore this war is being conducted without congressional authorization, and they're trying to take steps to limit the ability of the U.S. to participate in this war. They have not succeeded so far because the president still has veto power, still has his prerogatives as president, but it's very important. I think it's a message that I always share with officials in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Be careful. You know, this is going to have long-term repercussions for the U.S., your relationship with the U.S., because there are many in this country, Democrats for the most part, but also Republicans, who have a visceral dislike, distaste for this war because the U.S. has been so involved and because of the damage it's doing.
And does it go beyond this war? Because the architect of the war, Mohammed bin Salman, is involved in the blockade of Qatar. He's involved, many people believe, in the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. I mean, does there need to be a reassessment of the whole relationship with Saudi Arabia?
Well, I mean, we've written in the report, and we certainly are not advocating breaking relations with Saudi Arabia. I think on both sides there's reason to be dissatisfied. I mean, if I were sitting in Riyadh and I looked at U.S. policy for the last 10 years, more if you go back to the Iraq invasion, many questions on the Saudi side also about the health of this relationship. I think both sides need to sit down and figure out what the objectives are, where the differences are. And there are real policy differences. There's a difference on Yemen. There's a difference on Iran. There's a difference on the whole, we spoke about the Arab Spring, about what to do with Islamists, what to do when there's popular uprising. So I think there needs to be a honest conversation between the two sides and some readjustments.
And one of the disagreements you mentioned was, in the Obama times, the Iran deal. President Trump pulled out of that. You were one of the team that negotiated it. He says it's defective at its core, horrible one-sided deal, and he talks about the deal's sunset provisions, about the regime being on the verge of a nuclear breakout even when it was in the deal. What do you make of his criticisms?
Again, I don't think we should spend much time because his criticisms are either deliberately dishonest, or he hasn't read the deal or he doesn't know what's in it, because it was, as you said, I helped negotiate it, so I'm biased, but I don't think that the criticism that he's leveling against it is grounded in fact. You know, every deal, by definition, is going to be a compromise. So they were compromises. The U.S. didn't get everything it would have wanted, but it was a very solid deal to achieve the objective that President Obama had set from the beginning, to make sure that Iran is not in a position to get a bomb for at least for 10 years, and that the breakout timeline, what we call the breakout timeline, the time for Iran to have the capacity to have a bomb, would be at least a year for at least 10 years. And that's what was achieved. And what by breaking this deal, the president said that it was to meet several objectives, and the administration said, one, to get a better deal, and second, to moderate, to curb Iran's behavior in the region. What have we seen a year later? Iran is now itself moving away from the deal, so its nuclear activities are worse than they were under the deal. So far from having a better deal, we're having a worse actual reality. And second, just listen to what the U.S. administration itself is saying. Iran is escalating its behavior in its anti-American behavior in the region. So it clearly is not meeting its objectives, and it could well lead to a war, which I am profoundly convinced the president doesn't want. But I think he's on a collision course with himself, because his policies, whether he's aware of it or not, are leading towards the possibility of a military confrontation that his instincts oppose.
When you then compare that situation with North Korea, where President Trump says he has a love affair with Kim Jong-un, I mean, how do you make sense of this?
Oh, you know, making sense of President Trump is something that is I don't think I'm the only one who's struggling with. We have no problem with, or I have no problem, and our organization has no problem with his outreach to Pyongyang. That was the right thing to do. Now, of course, he created the crisis from which he then had to walk back, but much better to see them talking, much better to see them negotiating than to see the fire and fury that we were seeing back in 2007.
But there's no process. Won't we end up with the fire and fury again?
Let's see. I mean, I think both sides are going to have to moderate their demands. You can't have the maximalist demands that were on display when they met in Hanoi, where the U.S. basically is saying denuclearization first, then we'll remove the sanctions. And Chairman Kim is saying first to remove the sanctions, and then we might move towards denuclearization. We've advocated a incremental, step-by-step approach where the U.S. would gradually relax some of the sanctions and North Korea would take some steps towards denuclearization. That's the only realistic path. But if you're sitting in Tehran, and that's where your question was, there's one lesson, unfortunate, which is, why is North Korea being treated this way and we're not? And North Korea has a nuclear weapon and we don't. And I think that's a dangerous lesson, which I hope the U.S. does not continue sending to other parties, which is, if you have a nuclear weapon, then we're going to treat you with all of the way President Trump is treating Kim Jong-un.
Let's go back to the Clinton administration. Everyone remembers that handshake on the White House lawn in 1993. That, in many ways, was the high watermark of the diplomacy between the Israelis and the Palestinians. You were involved in the last year of President Clinton's presidency, organizing the Camp David summit. That went badly. Tell us what went wrong.
In some ways, Camp David came both too soon and too late. The parties were not ready for what was about to occur. They were not ready to talk about all the central issues, the core issues, the conflict. So in some ways it was too early. It was also too late because it took place in July of the last year of the administration. I think what we've discovered since then, since Camp David, which I may not have been able to tell you at the time, is that the gaps between the parties on the central issues of identity, of territory, of refugees, of security, of settlements, all those gaps are very wide. And it will take, and we didn't have it then, a very strong third party to try to get the parties to where they need to go.
Fast forward almost 20 years, and President Trump thinks the US is now that third party to do what he says is the deal of the century. Now, we don't know all of it yet. We only know the economic piece. but the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, in effect is doing the job you used to do. What do you think of the chances What do you think of the chances of his efforts?
I think in some ways we're spending too much time, we, not us, but just in general, the world is spending too much time talking about this deal of the century. In many ways, it's being implemented on the ground. I mean, we're seeing the decisions that the administration has made about Jerusalem, about funding for refugees, about recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. So there have been a number of steps already that are prefiguring what will be in the deal. But second of all, we know that when this is put on the table, if and when it is put on the table, the Palestinians will say no, because even if it's slightly better than people expect, it's going to be far less than what President Clinton proposed to the Palestinians in 2000, less than what was on offer during the George W. Bush presidency, less than what was on offer for the Palestinians during the Barack Obama presidency. So there's no way they're going to say yes. So we're going through the motions. They'll put it on the table. You know, maybe some people will be surprised at what's there. The Palestinians will say no. The Arab countries, for the most part, won't want to alienate the administration, so they're going to give us kind of lukewarm, well, interesting, but not quite what we want. Prime Minister Netanyahu, if he's prime minister at the time, will say yes, but, and then we'll go on to something else. So I think in some ways what really matters right now are developments in Israel, which is moving ever more to the right and consolidating its control over the occupied territories, and what's happening on the Palestinian side, where sooner or later there's going to have to be some change because it's been a sclerotic political system. Palestinians in their vast majority don't believe anymore in the two-state solution. They don't believe in American diplomacy. They don't believe in the Palestinian Authority. They don't believe in their leadership. So there's going to have to be some change there. The real events right now are going to take place in Israel and in Palestine. The deal of the century is a sideshow.
They don't believe in the two-state solution. Do you still believe in the two-state solution?
Listen, when you say, do I believe in it? I think everyone, not everyone, but I believe in it as still the best possible outcome. Do I believe in it as a realistic outcome? It's becoming harder and harder to say. You look at what's happening on the ground. It's been a systematic effort to make the two-state solution impossible. I mean, it's pretty easy today to say that the two-state solution is more and more a thing of the past. It's not very easy to say what's a thing of the present or of the future.
So let's look at the motivation for the two sides, because one thing that puzzles me, you look at Israel right now and the current Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. What end state does he actually want? He pays lip service to a two-state solution sometimes, but he doesn't seem to be doing anything that would support that idea. And he's going to end up with a situation where Israel still runs everything, and yet the Palestinian population is growing and eventually getting larger than the Israeli population.
One of the tricks, or what we try to do at Crisis Group, is put ourselves in everyone's shoes as objectively as possible. So I put myself in the shoes of an Israeli on the right, maybe of the center as well. And they look at the situation today, which in terms of security is probably as good as they've got, in terms of their imbalance of power with the Palestinians. The countries in their neighborhood are either absorbed by the internal problems or are at peace with Israel. So Israel doesn't really face that kind of threat. It sees a long-term threat perhaps from Iran. And it thinks if we tomorrow were to make a deal where we turn more land over or turn land over to the Palestinians, we will face an internal traumatic decision. What do we do with the settlements? How do we evacuate them? We saw what happened in Gaza during the unilateral withdrawal. But we also, by definition, are going to face a more uncertain time. Palestinian state, what kind of prerogatives would it have? What kind of security would it provide? So from an Israeli perspective, the status quo is much preferable to almost anything else that you could put on the table.
What could happen on the Palestinian side? Because right now you have the ongoing disunity, the division between Gaza and the West Bank, and you have an incredibly old leadership in terms of who the international community are dealing with. President Abbas, 83 years old,
and
elected for a 4-year term, and he's in the 14th year of a 4-year term. Something has to change on the Palestinian side.
And something will. Inevitably something will. At some point there'll be a transition in leadership. I think the international community is going to sorely miss the leadership that they've had for many years, because it was a leadership that was committed to a two-state solution, to a peaceful resolution of the conflict. Something will give. I don't want to sit here and predict what it will be, but there will be a change. By definition, there'll be a transition. And if you look at where the majority of the Palestinians are, particularly their young people, that's when it's going to raise questions about the future of the two-state, of their adherence to the two-state solution, of their adherence to the Palestinian Authority, which many Palestinians today view more as an instrument that Israel uses to perpetuate the occupation rather than an instrument of liberation for the Palestinian people. Why did the U.S. establish its monopoly? It's because it had a very strong relationship with Israel, so Israel accepted its mediation. And the Palestinians wanted to have a better relationship with the U.S., so they also invited the U.S. No longer true on the Palestinian side, but I'm not sure that there's any other candidate right now that the Israelis would look upon favorably. So it may be a case where the center of gravity of decision-making will be among the Israeli and Palestinian people.
The so-called Arab Spring 8 years ago coincided with the Obama administration, which you served in. Looking now with the great benefit of hindsight, it's a big mess, isn't it? 3 countries still in a state of war, Egypt, Bahrain, greater repression. What do you think, looking back, the international community did wrong?
Oh, that's a difficult question. I mean, it assumes that it's the international community that was the driver. I think these were really local events. What we see is that there were always 3 levels of the conflict. There was a local conflict between the citizenry that was rising up against its leadership, and a fight among the citizens themselves, between the more Islamist, the less Islamist, more secular, others. The second level was the regional confrontation, and that regional confrontation is one that very quickly took hold. Conflict between Iran on the one hand and Saudi Arabia and its allies on the other, but also the inter-Sunni Arab conflict between Qatar and Turkey on the one hand, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and others. And then there's an international dimension where the U.S. intervened, the Russians intervened, and the problem is, of course, the first dimension, that local dimension which people focused on, which was the most inspiring. People rising up against autocratic, sclerotic regimes, corrupt regimes. That one got overwhelmed by these other dimensions, the regional Cold War and then hot war, and the international intervention. And that local dimension wasn't able to be preserved because too much else got into the mix. And the Middle East, as I like to say, is both the most polarized region in the world, meaning you have all these divisions that I spoke about, all these axes, but also the most integrated, which means that what happens in Syria matters to Saudi Arabia, matters to Iran, matters to Israel. And so you cannot have an uprising that simply lives on its own.
Let's look at Libya, because in 2011, that's the only one that the West got directly involved in. NATO started a bombardment. It took a long time, but that helped the fall of the Gaddafi regime. Was the international community lacking in what it did after that? Should it have done more?
I mean, the answer to that question, any question you're going to ask me about, is probably yes. Would it really have changed the outcome, the trajectory of Libya, if there'd been more economic assistance, more assistance to try to stabilize the country? Maybe. What would it have taken to stop the militias? I'm not trying to say, and certainly not everything was done right in Libya. As you know, President Obama, who I served, has said that one of his big regrets was that more was not done after the toppling of Muammar Gaddafi. So clearly other things could have been done. But, you know, there's a reason when you look at the history of the region, and region writ large, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Yemen, outside intervention, let's put Yemen aside, but outside intervention, Western intervention, in all those cases, Syria has failed. The outcome is one that people look back and say it was wrong. And then you could always say, well, maybe had we done something else afterwards, or maybe if the intervention had been slightly different, the outcome would have been wildly more positive. But at some point you have to ask yourself the question, if time after time it goes wrong in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Libya, and Syria, maybe there's a limit to how much the West can do, even with the best of intentions, which are not always there, but even with the best of intentions, to get these countries right.
Let's look at the situation in Libya now. There was an internationally backed plan, and then in April, General Haftar launched his audacious offensive towards Tripoli at a moment where the UN Secretary General happened to be visiting Tripoli. What amazes me is, even though everyone says they support the UN plan, there are some people in the international community who believe General Haftar is a warlord guilty of war crimes, and others who think that he's the strongman saviour. And we don't even know where the US administration's position is, do we?
Right. Well, that's not a surprise. Not knowing where the US administration is these days is pretty commonplace. Yes, there are those countries that supported General Haftar, but you also have countries in the international community that have decided that the priority in Libya is the fight against terrorist groups, that what you need is a strongman, a military strongman to fight them, and Haftar was their candidate. They should have learned, and we warned about this for a long time, but as soon as General Haftar launches offensive, it is not going to work. It's not going to work the way the French may think. It's not going to work the way the Egyptians, the Emirati, or the Saudis, or Washington, or President Trump may think, because local politics. Always, you come back to the local politics. A lot of people militias are not very happy with what's happening in Tripoli. But if the choice is between Tripoli and General Haftar, they won't hesitate. So General Haftar's offensive triggered this alliance between entities who were not particularly on good terms at the time.
Turning to Syria, throughout the long and awful war in Syria, there seems to have been one mantra coming from the international community. You heard it from Obama, you heard it from David Cameron, you heard it from Ban Ki-moon, you heard it from everyone. There is no military solution. Where we stand now, was that wrong, and was there a military solution, and did Assad find it?
Yes and no. I mean, what people always say, I've said there's no military solution, in the sense that even if President Assad were to prevail, it would be a Pyrrhic victory, because the country would be devastated, because he wouldn't be able to reassert his authority the way he had before. I think this is a case where the Syrian regime won the war and lost its sovereignty. And that means that it has not won what it tried to do. And we now have this very sort of paradoxical, it's a status quo. I think we're in a new status quo, kind of status quo, frozen situation in Syria, which is what neither side really wanted. Assad is still there, and so the goals of the opposition and all those who back the opposition to see him topple, that's obviously a thing of the past. But the Assad regime was not able to reconquer the territory, and you have at least two areas which amount to a pretty big chunk of the country, over 30%. The northwest, where you have Idlib and Turkish, under Turkish influence, and then you have the northeast, where you have the Kurds with the support of the United States. And those areas at this point seem out of reach for the regime. If the regime has won the war but lost sovereignty, it's because the future of Syria, the real future, is now going to be determined by the United States, by Turkey, by Iran, by Russia, by Israel. Those are the actors, by Hezbollah. Those are the actors who are really going to determine whether the status quo, this frozen situation, remains frozen, or whether it opens up.
I'd like to examine one moment in that long war, and that was the red line.
Yeah.
President Obama said if chemical weapons were used, he would intervene. Looking at it now, was that a mistake? Did that embolden the Assad regime? Did it allow the Russians to enter fully militarily into the conflict? And did it affect other countries' views of the US's resolve beyond Syria?
So there were many mistakes made in the Syrian war, and I joined in 2014, the Obama administration, so I was not there during the Red Line episode. And of course, it's a story of a failure, because nobody could look back at what happened in Syria and say we succeeded, from a U.S. point of view. So clearly, I'm not defending the outcome. I'm not sure that the red line, I mean, maybe it was a mistake to have asserted the red line to begin with, but we could play out what would have happened if the Obama administration, if President Obama had decided to go through with what he has said with the strikes. It is at least conceivable that Syria would still have the vast quantity of chemical weapons that it had at the time, 90+% of which was shipped out as a result of the deal that was reached with Russia. It's not at all clear that the regime would have been toppled as a result of what, by its own admission, the Obama administration said would be pinprick strikes. It's not clear that Russia and Iran would not have redoubled their assistance to the regime in the face of U.S. intervention. So I think, this was not a pretty episode, and President Obama himself has acknowledged it. I do think, traveling around the world, it sent a message. Well, maybe the U.S. is not, we're not going to take its threats as seriously. But, I don't know that we should judge it by that. If it was the right decision not to strike, I would live with that decision, even if it meant that some countries were questioning U.S. resolve.
We focused in our interview on the Middle East, but for my last question, you can go anywhere in the world. One of the jobs of your organisation, the International Crisis Group, is early warning. Tell me where in the world is the next conflict, the next place we should all be worried about?
I mean, there's so many places where we could worry about. I think I could just tell you where we're focused. And some of these are conflicts that are ongoing. So we could go around the world. We could focus on country after country, whether it's Sudan, whether it's in the Horn of Africa, Venezuela, the Sahel. I think it's a theme that is very important to bear in mind, which is that U.S. policy today seems to follow a pretty conventional, or at least now what has become a conventional playbook: maximum pressure. We're seeing that in Venezuela, we're seeing that in Iran, we're seeing that on the Palestinians, we're seeing that in North Korea, coupled with demands, denuclearization, Maduro's exit, Iran negotiating a new deal, the Palestinians agreeing to these new parameters, and the promise of a nirvana-like future if those countries or entities agree to those conditions. The problem is that's not the way politics work. And we should know better, because the Venezuelan regime is not going to give in, and the Iranian regime is not going to give in, and North Koreans and the Palestinians are not going to give in. They'll fight for all kinds of reasons rather than simply surrender to demands that they believe go against their core interests. And we are, with maximum pressure comes maximum risk. And I think what we need now is maximum diplomacy.
Rob Malley, President of the International Crisis Group, thank you for talking to Al Jazeera.
Thank you for having me. Thanks very much.